Hello, I'm Russ Williams, and welcome to the training video for this strategy, a picture's worth 1,000 words. When you're introducing primary sources for the first time, or maybe if students have seen them before but have never really learned how to approach a primary source and fully analyze the source and to consider the context of the source and the author and the purpose and the point of view and things like that, we've also provided this template here. This is the AP Parts template. You may decide, especially early on in the year as you first introduce a picture's worth 1,000 words, you may decide to go ahead and introduce this AP Parts template as they do this exercise or this strategy for the first time. That way, they know the types of questions to ask as they approach a source. What should they be wondering about with the source? Of course, they should source it. They should consider the author. They should consider when it was written. They should consider what do we know about the author? What line of work was the author in? What bias might the author bring in this particular writing? The overall purpose, of course, the point of view. Who's the intended audience here? So these are just some great questions that the students can ask and analyze the source almost outside of the simple text of the source, but understand where that source falls in the historical narrative. How does this source help tell a story that we're trying to get the students to learn and to understand?
Again, the emphasis of the A Picture's Worth 1,000 Words strategy is to develop this mutual understanding of both the visual and the textual sources, and again, using those sources to complement one another.
The concept actually began in the real AP US History 11th grade classroom, where we took a difficult text, such as here, the Gospel of Wealth, and we found a complementary political cartoon showing Andrew Carnegie. It was usually covered as a beginning activity or a document of the day activity, and the students would take an excerpt from a primary source. They would underline key sentences or quotes, and then they would draw a line to those quotes, or from those quotes, to the parts of the images that really spoke to or enhanced the understanding or somehow correlated with the actual text. For instance, here, where the discussion is spent for public purposes, they drew the line to this political cartoon to demonstrate that within this Gospel of Wealth concept, that more money could be raised, for instance, for libraries, as seen here in the image. So teachers have used a few different approaches to this. Some teachers like to begin with the actual image. This is the daily bell ringer, for instance. Students walk in and immediately are engaged with an interesting picture, or again, painting, or even a map, or sometimes a chart to interpret. And again, that image will correspond with a textual source. This can be a primary source that sometimes is challenging for students to interpret, or this could be an article. Another approach is for students to actually begin with the challenging textual source. The idea is it's okay for students to struggle with the difficult source. And of course, they'll walk away from the text after the initial reading or two, and they'll feel, like there's a lot of ambiguous information, or they won't be able to fully interpret or comprehend everything they're reading. And then you add the image. And the image is supposed to then fill in the gaps within the text. For instance, if the primary source text was a description of life in New York City tenements in the late 19th century, you might find that the students wouldn't fully appreciate or even comprehend the difficult challenges of the environment until you added that image. Any number of images. You could pick anything, for instance, from Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, and you could combine it with that textual source again, and they would probably get a better grasp and maybe even generate a sense of a feeling, an emotional response once they saw the image, and that really those pictures, again, speaking 1,000 words in their mind about how difficult those circumstances might have been.
Let's use this example here. So we're going to look at a world history example from the Battle of Stalingrad, You would give the students the primary source, the text, and of course, the image in this case is a photograph of Nazi soldiers that was taken in January of 1943 in Stalingrad. All right, let's back up a second and talk about the concept of analysis. Okay, when we ask students to analyze something, as they're going to be asked to do time and time again, especially as they get in the upper levels, what ultimately, and there's a lot of definitions for analysis, but ultimately what we're asking them to do is to take it apart, study the pieces, and the end goal is to use those pieces to build or construct a greater understanding of the whole. So when they analyze documents, they're taking the documents apart in pieces. They're looking at key lines. They're looking at the overall, it might be tone or theme. Obviously, they're considering the author and the audience. They're looking at, of course, the date, the type of document it is. Same thing with images is you want to, and this, by the way, can be a little more difficult because students are so accustomed to just looking at a picture real quick and moving on. Well, to really analyze an image, you got to look at the foreground, you got to look at the background, you got to look for just the tiny details that sometimes we often neglect. This skill of analysis really we borrow from our friends in science when you think about analyzing the cell, for instance, and how they would break apart the cell and the mitochondria, the nucleus, and what those parts do to ultimately support the function of the whole. It's the same idea here with historical documents. What are the pieces, what are the parts of the documents, what do they do to help us get a better understanding of the whole document? And then by putting the textual and the image sources together, we get an even better understanding of the event that we're looking at. So again, you could give the documents, or give the textual document. You could give that first and allow students to struggle with it a little bit. Again, because it's going to be a primary source in many cases. You can use secondary sources for this, but if you're using a primary source, maybe you want them to struggle a little bit on the front end, and then you give them the image, and hopefully that aha moment occurs. Hopefully the image gives them a better understanding of what they're trying to comprehend or interpret in the actual textual source. You also can give them the image first. A lot of you like to begin class with a kind of a bell ringer. Students walk in and they see this image that you projected on the board, or on the screen or whatever, that's going to grab their attention from the beginning. And so maybe you want to give them the image and use the image as a way to kind of build into the text, that you think they can be in a better position maybe to comprehend the text after they see the image, and they kind of contextualize what it is that the document is going to be about, or that the text is going to be about. So again, either way, if you want to use a document of the day, or if you begin with a document of the day, maybe you want to do the text first. If you like to begin with kind of that hook, that bell ringer, that image that really introduces the lesson, give the students to kind of walk in and digest that. You may want to begin with the image. Again, there's no right or wrong way in terms of the approach. What I would encourage the students to do is, when they're looking at these together, is, well, first of all, I would encourage them to annotate, to really analyze and to annotate, to perhaps circle the proper names or that specific historical terminology, words like Führer, for instance. You might want them to underline key passages or quotes that really help them understand, or maybe not understand, but maybe help them really find kind of the main idea, or the key topic, or the topics of the document. And the same thing with the visual source, the photograph in this particular instance. you want them to maybe circle aspects of the image that will illustrate or capture the overall idea that's expressed by the image. It's a good idea, especially if you're teaching this for the first time, to use images such as political cartoons, because political cartoons, obviously, they've got a lot going on in the foreground and the background. So several aspects or several parts of that image really work to building an understanding of the whole. Now, this is totally optional, but you might even have them connect, some commonalities here between what they're reading in the text and then what they're seeing in the image. This might just help them, again, gain a better understanding of that mutual interpretation of the two together. Now, after they've had a chance to study the text, study the image in whatever order you want them to do that in. So after they've had a chance to read, to analyze, the next step, and this is optional, this particular template that you're looking at now is not really the ultimate end goal of the strategy, but this is like a building block. So for instance, if students are working on this strategy for the first time in August or September, and you're really still trying to build a lot of those reading comprehension skills, the idea behind this text analysis template is to teach them how to interpret a difficult, challenging, perhaps informational text. So, for instance, it gives them the direction here to read the first sentence of each paragraph and list what you believe each paragraph is about. Again, looking at those first sentences is like the topic sentence of each paragraph. So if I look back at the first sentence of the text from a few moments ago, I would probably, as a student, read that first sentence and come up with winter conditions compromised the safety of the Nazi position, or the Nazi position was weakened by the winter conditions, something like that. So you would just, again, insert what's that first sentence of each paragraph, what's the topic, and what is it ultimately about. Try to encourage them to put it in their own words instead of just copying the first sentence. And then it says, now read each paragraph, list anything additional information regarding what you answered above from just reading the first sentence. All right. So in looking at the paragraph as a whole, what's an essential detail that really kind of supports the topic sentence? So one thing I noticed in that first paragraph was there was no timber available for constructing defenses. One reason why they have such a weakened position. All right. So again, you can, especially as the year goes on, you can choose to not use this particular template, especially if you want to make this a quicker strategy, a quicker activity, because maybe you have something else planned in this particular lesson or this particular day of instruction. But early on, this might be a good moment to kind of what we say, to drive the telephone pole into the ground. What I mean by that is the way you kind of approach the sheer content that you're teaching throughout the year. And there's of course the idea of breadth versus depth. Okay, so I think of the coverage. I think of the breadth of content as the power lines. Okay, think of like the timelines of each decade that you're trying to cover, for instance. So you think about all those events and all the information you've got to get covered. All those standards you have to cover from August to May. Well, at times though, we need to slow down. We need to slow down from just coverage, and we really need to focus on depth. We need to slow down and establish an important foundation. We need to drive the power line pole into the ground, okay? And that's really what we do as teachers is we cover material and we slow down, and then we establish this is a really important lesson, or this is really important. Oftentimes it's a skill. So maybe for your students, they need to develop the skill of reading comprehension. They need to figure out how to interpret a text, how to analyze a text. So maybe early on when you're really trying to establish the skill, when you're really trying to put the telephone pole into the ground, you're going to use this template and of course the second part of this template that follows it. What are some unfamiliar terms? In this particular text, terms like railheads or flank, students may not be familiar with those terms. And then what's the technique that the author uses? Here in this particular text, I notice cause and effect. The winter conditions and the lack of resources have caused the Nazi advance to stall and weaken their position. Or this could be a descriptive technique. Okay, it could be multiple here. They don't have to fill in everything because not every text is going to fit, for instance, into is a chronological or problem solution compare contrast. It's going to totally depend on the text. So again, this goes back to the idea that the students need to be able to see what fits, what doesn't, eliminate, and just kind of leave blank areas that don't really match. So there's definitely some description here, the environmental descriptions that you see in the text. So I would say in terms of the technique, we're seeing a cause and effect, and we're definitely seeing some description. So as the students do this, again, for the first time or the first few times, maybe you want to use these 2 pages, these particular optional templates, again, to help them build their analytical skills. But ultimately, this is what we want to get to. So maybe it's October, November, or definitely the spring semester, and the students have done a picture's worth 1,000 words a few times now. Maybe they're more, they're definitely familiar with it, and maybe they have a pretty good grasp of it. So if you want to go quicker at this point, if you're thinking about the power lines, okay, and you're thinking about, of course, the breadth of coverage, and you got to get through several topics, for instance, during the course of the week, well, maybe the picture's worth 1,000 words now will be, instead of being a full class activity, it can be a 20-minute activity. All right, it can be a 30-minute activity, whatever. So this is ultimately what they're going to do every time. The Venn diagram, and they've probably done Venn diagrams on a number of occasions. But again, we have a circle here for the text, a circle for the visual, and obviously the overlap. Okay, what ideas are expressed by both the visual and the image? So I noticed in the text we see things, for instance, like the lack of fixed positions and defenses. They're not going to be able to hold out for the winter. The offensive, the Nazi offensive, needs to be stopped. And there's this conflict that you read about between high-ranking general and de Fuhrer and Hitler. There seems to be more of a half-hearted commitment now that it seems like the morale of the Nazi offensive is really declining. So you see General Halder, he refuses to advance and ultimately is removed. We get all that out of the text, and we don't get that in the visual. What do we get in the visual? Well, we notice, things that we would think are more simplistic compared to the text. We look at the text and there's so much more information there, but in that whole descriptive context of what's actually happening. What does it look like on the ground? Okay, again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we see that the eyebrows are frozen. We're looking at just soldiers, Nazi soldiers here. The eyebrows are frozen. Possibly a lack of needed supplies and adequate clothing. They can make an inference here. It's okay to take it a step further and say, based on what I'm seeing here, this is what I infer, that they don't have the right kind of clothing, or perhaps they don't have the proper shelter or lodgings for the conditions. And you could even notice they seem to be huddled up together. Perhaps they're trying to keep each other warm because they are freezing. So what about both? What do we see in both? Well, the weather is stalling the advances. The Nazis appear to be losing heart due to the conditions. And then you can even encourage students to take it a step further. So using background knowledge. What do you know about the event? What do you know about this, ultimately this Nazi campaign going deep into the heart of Russia in World War II? And you could say, or the students maybe could come up with these what we're reading about and what we're looking at here are the effects of Russia's scorched earth policy, destroying the needed resources that the Nazis needed as they invaded and occupied the Soviet Union, so that they really had to lean on that supply line that was now frozen over by the blizzards. So ultimately, by completing this kind of this deep analysis of the text and the visual, um, they walk away with probably a deeper understanding, comprehension of the Battle of Stalingrad, but also of the conditions that ultimately kind of brought the Nazi advances finally to a standstill, and then led to the Soviet counterattack. So hopefully you'll find the strategy is helpful when it comes to breaking down documents. Again, if you choose your own, we've provided several grade level options for pictures worth 1,000 words. But if you decide to choose your own, just make sure again you find that text and that visual that really complement each other. Again, the text can be secondary. It can be a passage from your textbook if you want to use that. Visual can be something that's already in the textbook. So you might find that it's already there waiting for you just in your text. But make sure that they really speak to one another. They really complement each other. That's the key. You can put the students in a difficult position if the text and the visual just really don't have a lot in common, or really don't help improve the understanding of the other, vice versa. So thanks for watching, and I hope this improves your understanding and your interest in using a picture's worth 1,000 words.